To view, Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed he sought and failed to have Yevgeny Prigozhin replaced as the leader of Wagner's fighters in Ukraine after the mercenary chief rebuffed his proposal during a meeting at the Kremlin. Putin's version of events, which appeared in an interview with the Kommersant newspaper, was a surprise admission that the Russian president was still negotiating a takeover of the Wagner mercenary group. International relations expert Thembisa Fakude argues that the proposed replacement of Prigozhin by Troshev, if it succeeds, could be detrimental for Africa. He joins us now to unpack this. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Perhaps let's start at the very beginning, when Wagner forces turned their guns against Russian forces, which in turn led to panic in Moscow. But after the coup was aborted and its leader accused of treachery, it was business as usual.
Well, it's not as business as usual. They like to make us believe that that's the case, but the tension continues. One, number two is we don't know at the moment where is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who led that mutiny against Putin. So it's still very concerning what's going to be happening. But I mean, the reports that Putin tried to convince some senior commanders of Wagner Group to change a commander is quite concerning. But also the fact that Yevgeny Prigozhin openly defied Putin in front of his commanders, and he somehow managed to go back and find himself in Belarus. That itself also questions Putin's authority or claims that he's in control of this at the moment.
Yeah. We know that Putin's version of events somewhat come as a surprise admission that he's still negotiating this takeover with the Wagner mercenary group. How should we make sense of these latest developments?
Well, we should be concerned if anything was to happen to Yevgeny Prigozhin. I'm not saying he's better than the proposed Andrei Trushev, who's West, by the way. In Syria, he is known for his Kosh-F war tactics. He's destroyed many places in Syria during the war. He's very close to Bashar al-Assad. In Chechnya, also from 1999 to 2009, he was involved in leading the Russian armies who went and created havoc in that country. So he's actually worse and much more feared by many members of the Wagner group and indeed the soldiers within the Russian army. So if he does take over, one wonders what will happen to African countries, because Wagner group, notwithstanding that, has been disturbed in Russia and the neighboring countries, is still very, very strong and working very effectively in most African countries. And chances are, by the look of things, other weaker African countries might be soliciting their assistance in terms of protection and army services for their countries.
Perhaps maybe go back a little bit to understand the aspects of last month's short-lived Wagner rebellion. What we were at least able to understand is how it exposed Putin's weakness and inability to manage the conflicts amongst the various power players in his regime. What do you believe to be Putin's broader strategy? What does it look like from the outside?
Well, regarding the mutiny, I don't think there was a strategy. I think they were caught off guard. The fact that you had the Wagner group marching 700 kilometers all the way to the gates of the Kremlin, they stopped 200 kilometers away and decided to go to Belarus, for me suggests that they were, one, allowed to travel without any impediment. And we're not quite sure the loyalty and solidarity that Putin often claims, that those people were going to stand up and protect him when the Wagner group was in Moscow. Many people believe that, a lot of people are going to just look the other way, because many people have lost money, many people have lost property because of this war. So there are a lot of people, particularly the oligarchs and the rich people in Moscow, like to see Putin moving away from the scene at the moment. But Vladimir Putin, of course, we don't know what's in his head. But since the beginning of this fiasco, we've seen him fumbling, not only in terms of communication and action. It's just not coordinated communication approach that one would have expected from Vladimir Putin, who's been very, very careful in terms of his propaganda skills and communications.
Yeah, because, I mean, there are seemingly some contradictions. On one hand, it appears as though Putin is also trying to win the loyalty of the Wagner rank, but on the other end, I mean, according to his interview, he's reported to have said that Wagner didn't exist in Russia, citing Russian legislation outlawing private military companies. Where does this leave the future of the Wagner Group? By the looks of things, it seems as though Putin, still needs them.
Well, it still needs them, but it's also double speak, because whilst the mercenaries and the Wagner Group is not allowed to proliferate in Russia, he allows it to create havoc and disturbance in other countries. So on one hand, he's saying, mercenaries are not allowed and soldiers of fortune are not allowed to operate in Russia. But on the other hand, he seemed to be claiming that he's actually in charge of this organization. The fact that he wanted to replace its commander, it means that he owns it, or at least that's what he's trying to communicate. So it's a really confusing one and a confusing speech. So we don't know what's going to be happening. But my only concern is that, of course, the outfits or the Wagner outfits in Africa, if they're left to be independent, you might just see further problems within countries, particularly where they operate, countries such as Central African Republic, Mali, and Darfur. So without the leader, we are likely to have the regional commanders taking charge and claiming ownership of the Wagner Group. And by the way, at the end of the day, they are businessmen. They are there to make money. They are soldiers of fortune. So they thrive on instability. So the more destabilized countries prevail in Africa, you are likely to find the Wagner Group, which makes many of us wonder, why will they not be involved in destabilizing those countries?
I mean, you spoke quite a bit about Putin's preferred commander, Andrew Troshev, speaking about, what that would mean should he be placed in charge for the continent. What would it mean for South Africa, given what we've heard about the relations that South Africa has been speaking of with Russia? How would that affect South Africa within the continent?
Well, South Africa might just find itself in a much more complicated position, not only within the continent, but internationally. The fact that they are now currently seen as supporting Russia, our former president is in Russia as we speak, that could create a bit of a challenge for South Africa, because if Andrei Troshev does indeed become the new leader, and with his reputation, by the way, at the moment is sanctioned by a number of European countries and the US. So if he does become the leader and he continues to operate in Africa, one is going to destabilize the foreign policies within Africa. But South Africa at some point will have to take a position against this very well-known criminal who's gone on to kill people in Syria and in other parts of the world. So it's going to be difficult for South Africa to remain neutral in this regard, especially as Wagner Group intensifies its effort in Africa. At some point, South Africa will have to speak, because Wagner Group is not doing any innocent work within these countries that are involved in it at the moment. There are a lot of atrocities that are taking place. So at some point, South Africa will have to voice its own position regarding the Wagner Group, which is now clearly, we all know, that it's a front of Vladimir Putin. It's a front that does the dirty work for Vladimir Putin, because the Russian Federation cannot be seen to be pushing the services that the Wagner Group are doing, because, of course, there are international obligations, but they can use a private army to do their dirty work, which is openly what Putin has admitted. So South Africa will have to take a position at some point in this regard.
How imperative do you think the loyalty of Russia's security forces will be in determining what happens next?
Well, Russia has got over 1 million strong army, and judging by what happened some couple of weeks ago when Yevgeny Prigozhin marched to or tried to lead his army to Kremlin, he wasn't stopped. That's one. Number two is there are reports that suggest that, notwithstanding the numbers, but many of them are demoralized. Many of them are not paid well. They've been struggling to fight a small, ill-equipped, undertrained army in Ukraine, most of whom have just, carried the gun for the first time. The students who decided to protect the country, but this army that we've been told about all the years has since failed to take over larger parts of Ukraine. That's the first point. The other point is, there is a problem about intelligence in Russia. When Vladimir Putin started this war on the 23rd of February, he led a 30-kilometer-long convoy, which was destroyed and stopped in their tracks by the Ukrainians, and it was because of bad intelligence. So there are a lot of people who are believing that Vladimir Putin is getting wrong intelligence. The fact that, for example, you have Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has become what has become, and only at the later stage they try to stop him, tells you that Vladimir Putin doesn't necessarily know precisely what's going on at the moment. So there is a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of wrong intelligence that's applied to him, and as a result is making mistakes. And those mistakes are likely to cost him. And I don't think you'll find the top military brass within Russia protecting him, because most of them, as I've said, they've lost property, they've lost money, and their families, by the way, are entrenched, and their kids live and study abroad. All of that has been disturbed. So it's not just business as usual for many of them, and they like to see the situation solved. So you are likely to have, therefore, some of them dumping him at some point.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps veering off the topic, but still staying in Russia. Former President Jacob Zuma is apparently in Russia receiving medical treatment. In terms of legislation and processes that may perhaps need to follow, how do you imagine that playing out when it comes to ensuring that former President Jacob Zuma is back in South Africa, and perhaps the impact his presence may have in Russia?
Well, first of all, it's disappointing that you have, the likes of Jacob Zuma go to Russia, as if South Africa doesn't have medical facilities almost that, as good as Russia. We've got some of the world's best medical facilities. There's no reason for any of the politicians to go and seek medical assistance in any foreign country, particularly from South Africa. But I think what Jacob Zuma is trying to do is, of course, not only is he undermining our country by, likening us to other African countries whose leaders and senior politicians have found themselves in foreign hospitals. So it's problematic, of course. That's the first point. The other point is, there's no other excuse except that he knew about what was going to be happening in terms of that ruling on Friday, and he had to find himself in a spot to where he can start negotiating his freedom. And the best place to do so is Russia. But it's also a smack on the face of President Ramaphosa and the foreign affairs fraternity in South Africa that has continued to speak well and positive of Vladimir Putin. Now you have President Jacob Zuma, who is, by the way, soon going to be seen as a fugitive in Russia, and this is supposed to be South Africa's friend. So it's going to create, at some point, at least during this weekend, it's going to start creating some sort of tension within the foreign position. Within the foreign affairs fraternity of South Africa, and Vladimir Putin might just, start talking to Ramaphosa in terms of what he's going to do henceforth, because if he's going to be harboring fugitives in inverted commas from South Africa, that is indeed contrary to what we've seen as a positive relationship that he enjoys between South Africa and Russia.
Yeah, perhaps that conversation has already happened, because we understand they were on a call together, President Ramaphosa and Vladimir Putin. But of course, let's leave it there for now. Interesting take. Thank you so much for your time, international relations expert Thembisa Fakude, just giving us some of the scenarios that may play out in Russia, and of course, former President Jacob Zuma being in that country.